Imagine two messages waiting in your inbox. One contains the result you want. The other contains the result you have been dreading. Before you open either one, your mind can already generate two complete futures, one bright, one unbearable. But the future you imagine has a strange design flaw. It contains the message and almost nothing else. The future you will actually inhabit contains breakfast, traffic, unfinished conversations, a song you did not expect to hear, and a dozen small demands that have nothing to do with that message. That difference is future emotional states. A substantial body of research finds that people often overestimate the emotional impact of future events. Researchers call this the impact bias, a tendency to overestimate the initial impact, the duration, or both. The claim is not that every forecast fails. The harder problem is scale and time. How intense will the feeling be? How long will it remain at that intensity? How much of ordinary life will it occupy after the event becomes one fact among many? This leads to the real question. Why can a mind that simulates a future event so vividly still misjudge the emotional future that follows it? The first answer is a spotlight problem. When you imagine a single event, the event fills the frame. If you picture winning a competition, the imagined scene contains the announcement, the recognition, and the relief. If you picture losing, the scene contains the silence afterward. The simulation is not necessarily false. It is incomplete. Timothy Wilson, Talia Wheatley, Jonathan Mayers, Daniel Gilbert, and Danny Axum studied this problem with college football fans. Across their first 3 studies, fans were less likely to overpredict how long a game's outcome would influence happiness if they first considered the time they would spend on other future activities. The researchers called the underlying mechanism focalism, focusing too much on the event in question while ignoring the emotional consequences of other future events. The key word is other. The imagined future is organized around the event because the event is what you were asked to imagine. The experienced future. Another deadline arrives. Someone makes you laugh. You become hungry. Your attention is recruited by whatever happens next. The focal event may still matter, but it must now compete with a world the forecast left out. That is why the error can feel so convincing. The forecast is built from a detailed picture, and detail feels like completeness. Yet a detailed picture of one event can still be a poor model of an entire day. To build the complete model, the simulation would have to make the focal event less focal. It would have to represent not only the result, but also every ordinary activity that will divide attention afterward. The sharper the imagined event becomes, the easier it is for the unimagined background to disappear. This creates 2 different meanings of importance. An event can be important in the story of your life without remaining the only source of emotion in every hour that follows. A forecast often merges those meanings. If the event matters, the feeling must dominate. Actual experience separates them. Something can matter deeply and still share the day with lunch, fatigue, routine, humor, and someone else's problem. The second answer is that the forecast leaves out what the mind will do after a negative event. Gilbert, Elizabeth Pennell, Wilson, Stephen Bloomberg, and Wheatley described a psychological immune system, a set of cognitive mechanisms that softens negative emotion. Across 6 studies, participants overestimated how long their reactions would last after outcomes including a romantic breakup, failure to receive tenure, and an electoral defeat. Their more specific mismatch concerned duration. The forecasts treated future emotion as if the mind would merely receive the event and remain unchanged by it. Experience is more active. People can reconstrue what happened, rationalize it, and redirect attention as other events compete for their thoughts. A forecast made before the event often omits those later processes because they have not been triggered yet. A pair of gambling studies by Deborah Kermer, Erin Driver-Lynn, Wilson, and Gilbert isolated part of this mechanism. Before gambling, participants predicted. After they actually gambled, the losses did not have as much emotional impact as predicted. The researchers found that forecasters underestimated their tendency to rationalize losses and overestimated their tendency to dwell on them. That result has a precise boundary, the gap between predicted and experienced emotion in 2 gambling studies. It shows that a forecast can include the event while excluding the mind's response to the event. Notice the sequence. Before the outcome, the forecast asks what the loss means. the loss or spend less time dwelling on it than the forecast assumed. The forecast treats meaning as a property already attached to the event. Experience reveals meaning as something that can be revised after the event arrives. Immune neglect concerns a missing response to an outcome already imagined as negative. The forecaster may picture the loss accurately and still omit the later psychological transformation described in the studies. The error occurs after the imagined event, in the blank space where the future mind should have been. So the imagined future response. But positive futures introduce another mistake. Sometimes the forecast misunderstands what will preserve a good feeling. Consider the desire to keep every option open. It feels safe because a reversible choice appears to protect future satisfaction. If you change your mind, you can simply choose again. What could flexibility possibly cost? Daniel Gilbert and Jane Ebert tested that intuition with photography students choosing prints to keep. The students believed that being able to change, but students who had the opportunity to revise their choice liked their prints less than students whose choice was final. The option to change impaired the processes that normally promoted satisfaction after a decision. The forecast treated flexibility as protection. The experience included a process the forecast missed. The opportunity to change impaired the post-decision processes that normally promoted satisfaction. Uncertainty can produce the opposite surprise. Wilson, David Centerbar, Kermer, and Gilbert studied people experiencing a positive event under conditions of certainty or uncertainty. Positive moods lasted longer in the uncertain conditions. The results were consistent with a pleasure paradox in which the cognitive processes used to make sense of positive events reduced the pleasure obtained from them. Yet forecasters tended to predict that certainty would leave them in a better mood. Certainty did not preserve the positive mood as forecasters expected. The experiments expose a mismatch between a story about future emotion and the emotion observed in those settings. The imagined self wants the pleasant event neatly explained. The experiencing self may stop returning to it once the explanation is complete. Finality and uncertainty now seem to pull in opposite directions, but the mechanisms share a theme. Emotion does not depend only on what happened. It also depends on what the mind does after the event. A reversible choice changes the post-decision processes that normally promote satisfaction. In the uncertainty studies, making sense of a positive event reduced the pleasure obtained from it. The forecast tends to value the option or the explanation directly. The experience is shaped by the mental process that follows. At this point, the pattern seems easy to learn. Notice that a forecast was too extreme, remember the mistake, and make a better forecast next time. But this raises the fourth question. Why do these errors persist when life keeps giving people feedback? Memory edits the receipt. Tom Mavies, Rebecca Ratner, and Jonathan Leave have examined this across 5 studies involving a Super Bowl loss, presidential elections, an important purchase, and eating candy. Participants mispredicted what they had actually experienced than the forecasts really were. That creates a hidden failure of comparison. Learning requires a gap between prediction and outcome. If memory moves the prediction toward the outcome, the gap shrinks. The forecaster can experience surprise without preserving evidence that the forecast was wrong. The researchers found that people with larger recall errors were less likely to adjust later forecasts. Reminding participants of their actual earlier predictions improved learning. Without that reminder, the remembered forecast could look more consistent with experience than it really was. This is more subtle than simply forgetting an event. A person can remember the game, election, purchase, or taste and still lose the crucial contrast between expectation and experience. The outcome remains available. The original forecast is what moves. Once it moves, the person no longer sees a prediction error large enough to challenge the forecasting method. The mind is therefore not merely a poor observer of its future. It can also become an unreliable auditor of its past forecasts. It produces the prediction, experiences the result, and later reconstructs the prediction using information from the result. The same system that needs the comparison is also editing one side of it. This completes the loop. Focalism builds a future around one event and leaves the rest of life outside the frame. Immune neglect leaves out the processes that soften negative emotion. Forecasts about choice and uncertainty misunderstand some of the processes that shape positive emotion. Then memory makes the old prediction look more accurate than it was. Forecasts miss magnitude, duration, context, or the mind's later response. That narrower conclusion is more interesting than a claim of universal forecasting failure. The imagined future is a scene. The experienced future is a system. A scene has one subject, one emotional tone, and a clean boundary. A system keeps admitting new inputs. Attention moves. Explanations form. Choices become settled or remain open. Memory revises the comparison after the fact. That is why a vivid prediction can be sincere, detailed, and wrong at the same time. Vividness tells you how clearly the mind rendered the focal event. It does not tell you how completely the mind rendered the life around it. So here is the question for the comments. What future event have you expected to dominate your emotional life, and what did ordinary life add to the picture once the event actually arrived? Next time, marginalia turns to flow and the unfinished science of what happens when attention feels effortless.